Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Let's jump in. Of course, if you would like to sponsor a class, sponsorships are available. It helps us do these classes. We really appreciate it. Okay, let's jump in. This week's Torah portion, not in the land of Israel, I should say, in the diaspora, is the Torah portion of Shalach, which means to send. If you're in Israel, then it's already Parshas Korach. That is because the second day of Shavuos was on Shabbos, so therefore we are one portion behind, because in the land of Israel they read the regular Torah portion, and we had to read the Shavuos reading for the second day of Yom Tov. So it's a little bit different, but if you're tuning in not from the land of Israel, even if not, the Torah doesn't expire, even if it's not this week's Torah portion. Okay. So what happens in Parsha Shlach? So Parsha Shlach starts off where God tells Moses that he can send spies to scout the land of Israel before the Jewish people conquer it. And we all know what happens. Moses sends 12 spies, one from each tribe, and they fail miserably. They come back, they say bad things about the land, 10 of the 12 spies, and Moses tells them that they are going to be punished, that they are going to have to stay in the desert for 40 years, and this generation of the desert is not going to enter the land. So let's dive in into this Torah portion. So that is how the Torah portion starts off. It starts off with this mitzvah. It's not really a mitzvah. This suggestion that God gives Moses, and so it says the word shalach, like we said, means to send. So God is telling Moses he can send spies. However, that's not the only thing that the Torah portion talks about. There are other mitzvahs in this Torah portion. For example, in Numbers chapter 15, we have the verse 18, we have the mitzvah of separating challah. It's a very important mitzvah. The Code of Jewish Law says that one should try to do this mitzvah every week before Shabbos, or at least some weeks before Shabbos. Jewish women all over the world and Jewish bakeries all over the world do this mitzvah where you take a piece of bread, a piece of the dough, and you give it to the Kohen. Nowadays we burn it. Okay. Then we have the second mitzvah that we have is the mitzvah that one should not blaspheme God. Okay, that's a very important mitzvah. We have another mitzvah, which the Torah portion ends with, which is the mitzvah of tzitzis. This is what Jewish men wear on their talis when they come to shul, or when they pray, or if they have a four-corner garment. There's a mitzvah to put fringes on the garment. This is in also end of chapter 15, verse 37. And seemingly, if we're going to name a Torah portion if we're going to name the Torah portion after a event, it should be a central event to the Torah portion. The Rabbi would teach us many times, I believe it's the teaching of the Shalah, that the name of a Torah portion, or the name of something, shows on the entire entity. So in other words, just because the Torah portion starts with the word Shalach, and we've discussed this in other classes as well, it's not just happenstance that happens to be one of the first words, is Shalach, so we call it Shalach. It must be central to the theme of the Torah portion. Now, if we're going to say a story about what happened many, many years ago, of this idea of the spies, and they were punished. Okay, that's very nice. It's important. Obviously, the Torah felt it was necessary to tell it, but what does it have to do with these other mitzvahs? And why is it so central? Where we could have maybe perhaps named the Torah portion after another mitzvah. We could have named the Torah portion of tzitzis, or the Torah portion of challah, or the Torah portion of don't do idolatrous activities. But instead, we name it after a story. So there's some sort of connection between this story of the spies and the story of the mitzvahs that come later in the Torah portion. So in order to do this, we're going to have to back up, and we're going to have to dive deep into the story of the spies and see what really was the mistake and what lessons we can learn from it. So the first source we're going to go to is the Medrash. The Medrash quotes than Numbers chapter 13. So Moses tells them, go up to the land through the south, climb the mountain, and seek his instructions. See what kind of inhabitants are there. Are they strong? Are they weak? Are they few? Are they many? What kind of land is it? Is it good? Is it bad? Are the cities fortified? Is it beautiful or barren? Does it have trees? Be brave and take from the fruit of the land. So that was the instructions that Moses gives to the spies. And again, all these different questions would influence their strategy of how to conquer the land. For example, if they live in an unfortified city, that means they're a very strong enemy. If they live in fortified cities, then they are a weaker enemy, etc., etc., etc. So what happens? They come and they tell Moses as follows. So let's read it. Continue reading in the chapter 13. It says they say to the Jewish people as follows: "We went to the land you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey, and these are its fruits. However, the inhabitants are mighty and live in large fortified cities. We also saw giants there. Amalek dwells in the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and Amorites live in the mountains. The Canaanites live in the coast and along the Jordan River." So seemingly, and then at the end, I'm sorry, before we go further, Kalev, who was one of the two, or Caleb in English, was one of the two spies who did not sin. Kalev and Yeshua, Caleb and Joshua did not sin, and they did not tell any lies or say bad things about the land. He quieted everybody down and he said, "No, we could conquer the land." But the other men said, "We cannot go up against this nation, for they are stronger than us." So seemingly, if we look back, what do you mean? They followed exactly Moses' instructions. Moses asked them, "Tell me about the land." They came back, they told him about the land. So what was the mistake of the spies? And in fact, Rashi comments on verse 27 where he says it flows with milk and honey. He says every single falsehood starts with a kernel of truth. So in other words, that they were telling true things, at least partially. So where did they go wrong? So the problem was that the mission they were given was not to was not to figure out could they conquer the land. Why? Because God gave them a directive. God gave them a mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel. And therefore Moses knew that if God told them to do something, they're going to be able to do it. And they were able to conquer the land of Israel. Now, however, God doesn't perform miracles for no reason. And therefore, it was incumbent upon Moses to do what was within the realm of nature to figure out how to actually conquer the land. And therefore, they send spies, and okay, let's see how we're going to do it. We're not going to rely on nature. Our purpose is to conquer land, is to settle the land, not in a miraculous way, but in a way of nature. Because again, if God told us we could do it. However, what did they say? They said we cannot conquer the land, and they tried to scare the Jewish people by saying things out of context, essentially, in order to scare them and show them that the land was not conquerable. And that was not their mission. Their mission was that to tell Moses how to do it, which brings up some important lessons. So the first lesson is that if God tells us to do something, it means he's giving us the ability to do it. Many times we find things and we say, "Oh my gosh, this mitzvah is so difficult. I don't know how I'm going to handle it." If God told us we could do it, we could do it. It's possible. And we just have to figure out how. And how does God know we can do it? Because He designed us. He's the designer. He's the creator. If you go read an instruction manual, and the instruction manual on a piece of technology or a tool tells you it could do something, you could believe that it could do it. Why? Because the person who created it is the one who wrote the manual. And the same thing applies to the Torah. The Torah is the manual from the Creator. So therefore, if God gave us a mitzvah, it means that we're able to do it. Now, at the same time, God wants us to use, not to rely on miracles, but God wants us to use this world because the purpose of creation is that God should have a dwelling place in this world. And therefore, it is our job to figure out what is the best way in nature, within the natural realm, within the natural means, what is the best way to do this mitzvah? Okay. Now we could find, well, we're going to see another lesson that we can learn from this. And another lesson we could learn is when we're doing a mitzvah, before we do a mitzvah, we say a blessing. At least most mitzvahs. And the blessings that we say, the blessing that we say before we do a mitzvah is we say, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. That we say that God made us holy with his mitzvahs and he commanded us. Now, why do we say this? This is showing us that when we do a mitzvah, it's not just that we're doing something, but we're actually, through this mitzvah, we are becoming holy and we are becoming connected and forming a bond with God. And which shows that we have to remember at all times that what are we accomplishing through this mitzvah? We're accomplishing connecting ourselves to God. And the same thing applies when we study Torah. When we study Torah, we say a blessing. If you ever came to shul and you get an aliyah, you'll say this blessing. Or if you've watched someone get an aliyah, it's also in the siddur every morning before the prayers. We say, "Asher b'chaban mikol ha'amim," that God chose us from all the nations, and God gave us His Torah. So we see that God gave us His Torah, and then we end up saying that God gives us the Torah. In other words, which means that it should be something new. It should be a whole new experience. God is giving us the Torah in the present tense. And so what do we learn from this? That before we do a mitzvah, before we go, just like before we did the mitzvah of going into the land of Israel, just like before we went into the land of Israel, we had to have spies to figure out what was the best way to do it in nature, and we had to figure that out. The same thing, that before we do a mitzvah, we should also figure out how are we connecting to God. How are we going to... I'll be with you in 1 minute. Okay?
Tell me why are you asking me questions I don't know the answers.
Okay. So the Torah tells us that we have to spy out, we have to scout out how, not just enough to scout out how to do the mitzvah, but how are we connecting to God through the mitzvah. We have to think about it, we have to contemplate it before we do the mitzvah, that this is a mitzvah from God, and therefore this mitzvah is going to connect us. And we see this in the way that we do the blessing, is that before we do the mitzvah, and before we study Torah, it's important that we understand that we're not just doing this well, it's another thing to check on the box. But no, it's a mitzvah, and through this we are connecting to God. And so therefore, this idea that before we do a mitzvah, we have to figure out how we're going to do it, and that we have to know that we can do it, and we're going to figure out, just the only thing we need to know is how we're going to do it, and we have to remember before we do the mitzvah, we have to scout it out. We have to remember that and we have to remember that this is a mitzvah that's going to connect us to God. And we're not just doing this because it's something to check on the box. This is why the Torah portion is called Shalach. This is why the Torah portion uses this story, where Moses sends out the spies. And the spies made this mistake. However, the lesson that Moses gave them is that before we do a mitzvah, we're going to realize how this is how is this connecting us to God. And we're going to figure out that we're going to know that God, we can do this mitzvah because God gave it to us. That is why this Torah portion is called Shalach. And that applies to all the other mitzvahs that are in this Torah portion. The mitzvah of Challah, and the mitzvah of tzitzis, and the mitzvah of oneness of God. All these mitzvahs, and it applies obviously to all the mitzvahs. The entire Torah portion is based on this story, not because it's a story, but because it's a lesson. And the lesson is that we can do it, we will do it, and we will know that this is how we connect to God, through Torah, through the study of Torah, and through the performance of mitzvahs. Thank you very much for joining. Hopefully you have a wonderful Shabbos, and God willing, we will see you next week.